Let's talk about the very first topic of today, and that's going to be Zcash. So David Boyer says there's actually a fundamental change that drove Zcash's boom. Zcash usability greatly increased starting late 2024 due to the Zashi mobile app, and therefore a large accumulation of shielded coins, which we know has to be actual believers, not just coins on exchange. The large increase in shielded supply occurred all the way through 2025 before the breakout. You can verify this quite easily. So it's surprising to hear you say that you think nothing changed with Zcash to cause the breakout, and it makes me think it was a good call, was more luck than logical forecasting. So let's talk about this, right? And this is, first of all, anytime you take something down to a single metric and you're like, that's the thing that drove the growth, right? It's a bit of an overstatement, I would say. I'm going to show you guys outside of this some things that happened, along the way and on timeline here on the chart that really should have impacted price the opposite way of what we've seen fundamentally. So when I said, especially from the start, that nothing changed fundamentally, we didn't have a massive change in the way that the protocol operates. There wasn't a change in tokenomics, there wasn't a change in issuance. All of the key core fundamentals for Zcash as a whole stayed pretty much the same, right? Of course, upgrades happened, but there wasn't anything groundbreaking from the actual breakout candles at that moment that led to that huge set of impulses. So let's first of all take a look here on Blockwork. So we have the metrics here for Zcash shielded supply. So it says right here in the description, total Zcash held in privacy preserving shielded chain value pools. Read a little bit more here on the bottom. Shielded supply tracks the total amount of Zcash held in networks privacy preserving shielded chain value pools, representing funds whose amounts and ownership are cryptographically protected. Zcash has evolved through 3 generations of shielded protocols. You guys can see here, there's the gray, the green, and the blue, which is going to be Sprout, Sapling, and currently Orchard, which is the most current standard offering with the strongest privacy. When users shield their Zcash, they move funds from the transparent pool where balances are publicly visible like Bitcoin, into one of the shielded pools where zero knowledge cryptography obscures transaction details. So yes, we did see an uptick when we look here on a quarterly basis from 2024 forward. Let's first of all correct one thing. We actually saw the Zashi wallet in Q2, right, of 2024. So you look at this over here and we see Q2. You did see, a little uptick from the previous, last few quarters in here, but it wasn't a huge explosion. You saw, some continued growth in here from those quarters moving forward. Most of the, astronomical growth in here happened in a very short period, and you can see that it was tied very closely to the performance that you saw on the chart. So of course, over time, as supply becomes more limited and you see some of those tokens being moved, into these more privacy-based wallets, you start to see protocols that make it a stronger value potentially to store on those particular protocols. Yeah, maybe you see a bit of an increased interest, but this really doesn't paint a very cohesive picture, because remember that when we're looking at these shielded addresses, this doesn't tell you about number of individual accounts, right? This can be treasury reallocation. This can be privacy-focused funds reallocating. I don't think that it really matters if these people are more serious when we're considering the impact on price directly in itself. Let's take a look at the chart here that I kind of dressed up a little bit here. And again, anything you guys see here with the dates, this is the approximate month that these events occurred. So we don't need to get crazy about, well, it's not January 10th. I'm just showing you guys kind of timeline wise and what was happening price wise, what's kind of created some of the weird Zcash, fundamental story that we've been tracking here. So, you look at Zcash history, you had some initial launch price here in 2016, wasn't able to really get any bids here up at these prices. You guys can see, whoops, we're going to get rid of this here. You guys can see that when we move forward here, we start to get some narrative that follows the chart here. So over here in 2021, we saw South Korea bring out the travel rule, and essentially created like a much tighter AML situation where it was very difficult for centralized exchanges to remain in compliance. From there, you actually saw price rally pretty decently, for another several weeks there before topping out. You saw over here in January of 2022, Canada tightening their AML enforcements, leading to additional privacy delistings, which you continue to see that a downtrend that was already intact there. You look over here, you saw a pretty big cluster over here in 2023 forward. You have Dubai moving to ban privacy tokens. You have the EU MiCA framework here in April of 2023, which again put a pretty big chokehold on centralized exchanges. You have the EU markets begin delisting here in June of 2023. Over here in December of 23, we saw OKX announce delistings, followed by Binance delisting just a few weeks later. Same month there, same time frame, we saw India's FIU banning privacy tokens. finally, after all of this, right, all of this crazy narrative in here, you get after this period here where you actually get a negative change in the, fundamental story or narrative of what's happening here. You guys see that the Zashi wallet here in March of 24 launched. You actually see price decreasing here a bit. We see finally here as well in May of 24, EU moves to ban privacy tokens in 2027. Price actually continues to rocket after we see these narratives set in. And you guys can see over here, we saw two very interesting narratives in January of this year. We saw DFSA and VARA, which are from the Dubai conversation we had a little bit earlier, harmonizing to bring that privacy ban into full enforcement in effect. And then simultaneously, Electric Coin Company, which was the essentially pseudo foundation behind the Zcash project as a whole, dissolve and essentially make an announcement that they're going to be moving towards a different model to allow for fundraising and the continued expansion of the ecosystem. You can see in both these instances here, we actually saw price continue to correct. So back to your kind of an initial comment here, can we look at that metric and say, was there a continuous increase from Zashi wallet forward that said, yes, we're ready for higher prices because there's a bigger amount of believers in Zcash because they're storing them in the shielded pools or shielded addresses? I personally don't think so. When you roll back to this chart here, and of course you can see these upticks in here, if you kind of look at just the older price action in here, let's take this prior to that point. So let's go to 2024. So we'll go to like Q2 of 2024. We'll go about there. Up to this point, prior to the Zashi wallet, you saw continuous upticks in growth and amount of shielded supply that was coming on exchange. So yes, we can point to an area where that influx starts to look a bit more dramatic, but it's all relative because you probably could have made that same argument, when you saw previous pumps or, other little tiny pieces of price action and said, this is what impacted it. The story from 2016 forward is logarithmic growth. I'm going to show you guys, though, what I pointed to my team, and it really was a very big technical story. So when we look at the chart here, a lot of people undervalue these opportunities here. They look at the price action that's been occurring. One of the biggest narratives that we saw in 2021 or following 2021, and it was a pervasive narrative. If your token didn't make a new high in 2021, it's probably a dead project. It's probably not coming back. You need to look at things that made a new high in 2021. That was a huge narrative that people were playing into. A lot of people were very afraid during a lot of these narratives that I illustrated here about all the delistings. Even in our own group, we have a long post that I made as the market was really in these depths of despair down here about, I get that this, isn't going to fit everyone's risk appetite. For me, the privacy narrative for Zcash is there. We're following the same mechanics of proof of work that people find valuable in Bitcoin, have the halving schedule, shielded addresses, the long-term value for somebody who cares about decentralization and privacy for Zcash was still there. But of course, that delisting narrative always really kind of shakes people up. I would say that people who have their Zcash on exchange aren't true believers, or they're not somebody who really cares or believes in the project. Some people are just not really very good at self-custody, right? And you have to know yourself, because at the end of the day, I know that 99% of you guys, even if you guys are passionate about this project, are not buying Zcash strictly because you love privacy and you tend on using this in a transactional fashion on a regular basis. I know that for a fact, right? You buy 99% of these assets because you think that there's a speculative value long term for them, not because you plan to spend them. So even if you keep them in a shielded pool or keep them on exchange, which again, probably we'll see a little bit less exchange volume over time if this narrative picks up here, or you're going to see more tokens become unshielded or have to account for them in a separate way in order to remain compliant with AML. For me, the technical picture was here the whole time. When we started to get below this $50, $60 mark, that's when I really told my team, hey, we're going to keep this DCA up. We're still, trading right here above these multi-year lows. We barely popped a new low here in 24. When we saw this round in this continuing to set in here, that was one of the things I pointed to for months and months on end. And again, I have over, 1,100 episodes on our CryptoCharge website now. So you guys can go back as far as you want and see what we were talking about at that time. But as we started to see this roundedness set in here on the chart, this is just typical accumulation behavior. And of course, it's always easier to see that accumulation once it's already been finished off and you see that there's been a break there. We talked about this being a cup and handle for a very long time. We talked about the multi-year lows being held in there. We talked about the pivot zone here in the 70s that was really going to make the big difference. And of course, seeing this nice break here was just confirmation of all of that. Everyone wants to try to target this here and find that they're going to find the perfect narrative and the right influencer that's going to tell them you can buy right now because we've just broken this and it's going to go up and you're going to have zero drawdown, right? But that's really not where the money is made. The money is made by just keeping your head down and accumulating in areas of deep interest, which we were in essentially for 1,200 days. You had 1,200 days to buy a sub $70 Zcash. So even at that point, if you had bought from the 70s, right, you'd still be up roughly 600, 700% right now. So this wasn't a lucky guess. There's a lot of charts that have this key compression pattern in here, that long forming pennant structure in here. XRP did it. Many other assets did it. So when you understand that you're invested in something that has strong fundamentals, which I don't disagree with, that there are strong fundamentals. I do like that the Zashi app has, created more tooling and availability for the general public. But this schematic here was always telling the story of what's to come, and really now everyone thinks that $400 or $500 is a great price for Zcash, right? Or Arthur Hayes can't shut up about a $10,000 Zcash now, when literally everybody was as bearish as they possibly could be, as you saw that onslaught of narratives that we just discussed here for Zcash. So I respect everybody's opinion to what the catalyst was, but that's not enough in my opinion to quantify and justify what we've seen here on the chart, which did show clear technical patterns of a reversal. If you guys looked at this the other way and we saw this type of roundedness setting in here and you saw this breaking down in here, be like, that looks very distributive, right? But that's not the case. There's a very clear technical case here for a long-term breakout. So now that this breakout has ensued, there is really probably some more need for consolidation, but I do think that we get out to some $1,400 plus prices here as we see the market as a whole cycle higher.